enough with announcements. Let's get on with the show. So it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our first keynote speaker. I've heard her speak in a couple other conferences and just super inspired by her work, and really exciting to hear how she's really cultivating connections between a lot of different people in a lot of different sectors. So Brook Thompson is a Yurok and Karuk native from Northern California. Growing up, she lived and fished on the same land that her ancestors have been since time immemorial. Brook fights for water and Native American rights through public speaking, academic research, and frontline activism. She's been an intern for the City of Portland's Bureau of Environmental Services, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in DC, the California Water State Resource Control Board Office of Information Management, Save California Salmon, and now she currently works as the restoration engineer for the Yurok Tribe's Fisheries Design and Construction Program. So she's done a lot already in her career. So she's also got a lot of awards for all of her inspirational and innovative work. In 2017, Brook was awarded the American Indian Graduate Center's Undergraduate Student of the Year. And in 2020, she won Unity's 25 Under 25 Award. And in 2022, she was accepted into the Water Solution Network. Brook is a graduate of Portland State University with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and with a minor in Political Science and a Master's in Environmental Engineering at Stanford University. And now she is attending UC Santa Cruz, where she's getting a PhD in Environmental Studies, where she studies how Indigenous knowledge can be better implemented into California water policy. Brook's goal is to bring together water rights and Native American knowledge through engineering, public policy, and social action. So again, we're really excited to hear her speak in this keynote right now. And I also wanted to point out that if you can't get enough of her, which I'm sure you won't, if you look at page 9 of your program, she will also be speaking in the knowing section at 4 p.m. And she'll be speaking with Ivan Senak about how to successfully work with local tribes. So please join me in welcoming Brook up to the stage.
Is this a mic?
Yeah.
Hello?
For the computer.
Oh, okay. And then I use that mic. Up here. Oh, we got it. Oh, one back. Can I take this?
Yes, you can.
Okay. That was such a nice introduction. But yes, hi, my name is Brook Thompson. You pretty much heard my entire life story, but when I think of distilling myself down to my most basic about who I am, if I had to describe myself in one sentence, I'm basically a woman who just really likes salmon at the end of the day.
I'm sorry, hang on half a second, or just talk, would be amazing.
But as you see from the photos in the back, my entire life growing up has been revolved around salmon fishing and spending time with my family and my tribe on the Klamath River in Northern California. And for me, that's just the norm of what life was, is going out into the river early in the morning, setting net, and waiting for salmon to hit it while we're chatting on the riverside, roasting hot dogs, marshmallows to my dad's dismay, because I often get them in my hair and it's impossible to get marshmallow out of your hair. And then this is my grandfather, Iwak Archie Thompson, who was the last native speaker of Yurok. And so I'll do my introduction in Yurok as well too, very quickly. So I agree, Nick now Brook Thompson, wotek me wak me ko Santa Cruz ook pudaglawe ese pictuglawe. So I'm currently living in Santa Cruz, but I'm from the Yurok and Karuk tribes in Northern California, and I'm from the Watek village in the Yurok tribe. And to this day, my love of salmon has not stopped. So these are some photos over the last few years. This is the biggest salmon I've caught before. And so I like to show that one every time because I'm very proud of it. But these are just to get you a sense of how much time I actually spend around salmon. I mean, I probably have met more salmon in my life than I have people, honestly, which is saying something as a public speaker. But for me, salmon are just like an inherent part of my life. they have fed me so much over the years. And they have always been there as a way where I get exercise from catching them, where I get the nutrition from eating them, and I get that family time by hanging out on the river with my uncles, with my aunties, and my cousins. That's what made it even more devastating for me when I witnessed the 2002 fish kill on my river. So over 60,000 salmon were killed and died on the Klamath River when I was 7 years old. And for me, this is important to mention because this is really what defined the rest of my life and kind of what brought me to that list that was read out earlier about all these different things I've done. Because for me, right, we've been fishing on this river for thousands of years without an issue. No elders have ever heard a story of a fish kill this bad ever happening in our history. And yet overnight, these salmon that were alive in the morning time, they were gone. And these salmon are the connection to my ancestors. These salmon's great-great-grandparents had a relationship with my great-grandparents, and they have this unspoken contract that they'll take care of each other, that my family and the tribes will take care of the salmon, and in return, the salmon will be there for us to help feed our families and keep us healthy. And for me, as a young person, right, when you're 7, you ask all these questions to your parents, like, how does this work? Why does this happen? And you hear why? But because of this, I had to start asking myself, why did this happen to my tribe? Why was this a situation we're going through? Why did this have to happen? And how do we make sure it never happens again? And for me, a lot of those answers ended up being off the reservation and in places that my people currently were not at, in these political positions all the way to the national level, and also through education. And so for me, pursuing education and learning about politics is a way for me to help others make sure that this situation never happens again. And it's scary because we get close to this happening almost every year. And we have to push to make sure we get enough water for our salmon every single year. But yeah, so I ended up doing all these things because of that one situation in my life, and finding out that, you know, it's one thing to have all this indigenous knowledge and to have all the people on the ground saying, this is what we need, this is what the salmon need. But then you're listened to so much more when you have these letters behind your name, when you have these degrees behind your name. And for me, it's kind of upsetting seeing that the farther I've gone on, the more I'm listened to. But yet, I'm holding you all captive here today and you're listening to me right now, obviously. But, right, I'm saying the same things that a lot of my tribal people are saying. I just have now these degrees behind my name, and so I'm listened to more. And so going back to conservation, what I really want to focus on here is how conservation, I've learned about it through American history and how we've got to where we are now. So a time before quote unquote American history, because in school, I feel like I was only taught about history up until like, you know, Columbus quote unquote came here, didn't come here. But that's when like my education started with like my school history. But before then, these tribes here have been living sustainably for thousands of years, since time immemorial. And through those thousands of years, it was close observation, understanding, and relationship with these plants, animals, rocks, water, etc. And I think this is a misunderstanding because a lot of presidents throughout history, and this is kind of what I've gotten through my history education, is that Native Americans were like kids that they needed to be taken care of, and they weren't treating the land correctly, aka they weren't farming it and extracting the land, and therefore they need to be removed. And because of this language and this understanding that was this narrative that was forced onto the American public, that natives don't know what they're doing and we need to take care of them because Western civilization is best, and they know what's going on, that it just makes sense to remove them, giving way to justifying removal of indigenous peoples from the land. And these are some photos from my area of the 1800s of people utilizing the waterways. So how did we get to a point where we actually need restoration ecology? Because we don't have a formal restoration ecology traditionally, right? Like, it's kind of a newish thing, because before we were living in harmony with the land for the most part, and we didn't need a whole separate category to restore something that was never destroyed in the first place. There were times such as the Buffalo Massacre, where the American military specifically killed thousands of buffalo in order to starve indigenous people's food sources to help during the Indian Wars, to help the Western side during the Indian Wars. And so you can see, I'm sure most of you have seen this photo, it's pretty famous, but just the pile of buffalo skulls that person is standing on top of, and how devastating that was. And right, this isn't the only case, this is just one case of very many. And then again, Native American removal, for example, how it's becoming more popular, most people probably know about prescribed burning, and how we helped the forests by making sure there was less undergrowth that was happening, so there'd be less large fires, and burning regularly to help create prairies and to help sustain forests that require fire annually over time. But yeah, just seeing how quickly and how devastating our land loss has been. And then there's poor land management. So one thing I definitely learned about for a really long time in history class was the Dust Bowl. And part of the reason, in addition to long droughts and the weather condition, poor agricultural management was a reason for the Dust Bowl. And part of that was through government policy, pushing people to develop more and more land and use agriculture practices that weren't sustainable. And then there is the removal of forests. This is the example on the right side of research that shows how mangroves help distribute the energy that comes from waves to make sure it's less impactful inland. And yet, I think it's around 34% of the world's mangroves have been destroyed. And a lot of it has been just for aesthetic reasons. We have destroyed a lot of our coastlines and our floodplains for what seems easy in the moment and what's useful within like 10 to 20 years without thinking long term. And with indigenous knowledge and stewardship, part of that is not only the hard data science being like, if you plant this in this pH soil or this type of soil and region, it will grow best, etc. But it's also the value system that we have about how we treat plants and animals and how we see them in our world that help contribute to how we take care of them. And also that long-term vision of helping 7 generations ahead of us. How are the plants we're planting now going to change within the next 7 generations, hundreds of years from now, to benefit those people then? And I think this is important when you see like sidewalks in urban areas, you see all those roots uprooting the sidewalks and making cracks. I mean, those are people not thinking 20 years ahead when they're planting those trees in the sidewalk spots. And so it's obvious to me that we need to take some lessons from indigenous peoples, especially when it comes to ecological revitalization. With the deforestation, 24% of the carbon stored above ground is in the world's tropical forests, which are collectively managed by indigenous peoples. And with biodiversity, indigenous peoples protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. And so to me, what that tells me is we should be supporting indigenous peoples to be doing what they want to do and been doing since time immemorial, because they know the area well. And also, like for me with the salmon, it's like for me and a lot of my tribal people, it's a life or death situation for us. Like we cannot exist without the salmon. And so for us, it's more than a job. It's more than a goal. It's our whole world that we're fighting for. And then when it comes to the Dust Bowl, one of the issues with the Dust Bowl was the nitrogen fixation in the soil. But then again, if we were learning from indigenous peoples, right, we have the 3 sister companion plants, corn, squash, and beans. And one of the reasons, there's a lot of great things about the 3 sister plants, I'm sure many of you have heard of them, but one of the great things is the nitrogen fixation from the beans, and showing that we have an understanding of that complex soil cycle of nitrogen that could have been very useful during times like the Dust Bowl, where we then had to have someone like Carver revolutionize the peanut plant to do nitrogen fixation instead. And we could have stopped all these tragedies from happening if we just had more Indigenous involvement from the get-go. And then for something that's been really interesting to me that I was never taught about is seeing natives as endangered species themselves. The photo on the left, your left, is by Edward Curtis, who was kind of a controversial photographer and took tons and tons and hundreds of photos of Indigenous peoples throughout his time. But one of the things that's controversial about his photos, and that you'll notice if you see a lot of them, is he often has natives looking out sadly into the longing distance, like they're going away. And he did this because he was trying to capture the Indigenous peoples who survived the first wave of colonization. And he had this kind of fear that Indigenous peoples were eventually going to disappear. And he tried to display that through his photos by purposely having Native people pose this way. And then this is something I didn't learn about until I was reading a book in college a few years ago. But there is Native American zoos, especially at the World's Fair. It was a big attraction with Buffalo Bill and all of that jazz. But this photo on the right is Chief Yellowhair and his council in front of replica teepees at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. And they were also there at the Chicago Fair. And there was actually a young Alaskan woman, I believe, who was born and her birth was watched at the Chicago Fair. And so, the idea of like Westerners putting us in these areas and thinking that we're a disappearing species sometimes relates to me with how we see things like plants, animals, and salmon. We're very resilient. Obviously, I'm still here, and there's tons of Indigenous people who are still here and fighting every single day, living and re-understanding and recultivating their traditional ways. And we're growing as a people, and we're helping rebuild our own culture and helping others to understand the world. And yet, for a long time, we were seeing like we were just going to go away, and that's going to be the end of it. Everyone take their pictures. And so, for me, I feel kind of like the salmon, where I have this fear that one day there won't be salmon, but also understanding like being in this environmental studies PhD, salmon are so strong and they're able to withstand such major changes in the environment. They just need a little bit of extra help and push. And this brings me to this quote from Beyond Higher Education as We Know It, which is, "Modern science and technology has a role in co-creating the project of coloniality. There are ecological systems of oh my gosh, these words are even big for me. Extra activism, which is reproduced through endless consumption of finite natural resources for human use." And so this is to be reminded that colonization is not just something that happened in the past. It's something that's continuously happening through land and how we're seeing ecological restoration. And then that also brings me to something I didn't know until I was college. Also, I feel like we need to redo like our public education system, because I feel like I should have known a lot of these things and shouldn't have had to pay for college to learn about them. That's a side rant though. Is that things like the Sierra Club, which I see all the time sending me tons of emails every single day asking for money, was founded by a white man, and it was originally created to be a white man's exploring club. And so John Muir was good friends with Theodore Roosevelt too, and they were both known as being these great conservationists. And Theodore Roosevelt was known as being the conservation president even. And part of their effort helped create the national park system. But John Muir was a known white supremacist who believed strongly in eugenics. And also, I, as a kid, when we were learning about presidents, again, going back to my US history classes, I was like telling my dad how much I liked Theodore Roosevelt, and he's my favorite president because he helped create the national park systems and helped create all these national parks. And you're right, he didn't shoot that one bear that was tied to a tree, so good for him. But then when I told my dad that, he was like, well, Theodore Roosevelt wouldn't have liked you. And I paused and I was like, what do you mean? Like, you didn't talk to Theodore Roosevelt, you don't know that. And he said that he didn't like Indians. And I was in the car, right? And I was just like, it's something about my worldview cracked that day, because it's like, they never told me that in history class. Like, I feel like that should have been an important point. But he told me this quote, which stuck to me really hard, which is by Theodore Roosevelt. "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th." And so for me, this completely destroyed my view of Theodore Roosevelt. And I wanted to like him so badly. And I was told all these good things about him. And it seemed like all my other classmates and my teacher were really gung-ho about him too. And for me, now this person I saw as like this great conservationist, all of a sudden felt like, oh, he's great only for some people, but not for me. He wouldn't have liked me. And I think of those points in my childhood that kind of constructed my relationship with what it means to be a conservationist, what it means to belong in ecology and restoration work. So it is not enough just to decolonize, but we must also be anti-colonial. And so this is kind of in the same point as if you heard like not being racist versus being anti-racist. We have to purposely work towards anti-colonialism in current day restoration work. And this is a quote from the Clear Lab book, which I'll recommend later, but this whole book is really good and it's free online. "Too often we have seen and heard decolonization mean inclusion or anti-capitalism or environmentalism. Those things are not synonymous. Inclusion of Indigenous peoples into empire was accomplished via residential school, which my grandfather, Thompson, was forced into at 8 years old. And conservationism that removes Indigenous peoples from land are all forms of colonization. As Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang say, decolonization is not a metaphor. If your interventions do not change relations to Indigenous lands and life, it's not decolonization." And that brings me to some of the work I've been doing with revegetation with the Klamath Dam removal. So part of the reason all those salmon died initially in 2002 was because of the dams on the Klamath River. There's currently 6, but right now there's plans for 4 of them to be removed, starting with the first one this summer. And so yeah, we're gonna ramp up. Very exciting. I almost don't believe it. I'll believe it when I actually see the first dam come down. But until then, I'm still skeptical. But with that, there's going to be all this open area that comes with the dam removal with the lakes being drained. And with that, we are trying to, and we being RES, which doesn't stand for reservation, ironically enough, but RES, the company hired by the Klamath Renewal Corporation to do the restoration work, which then hired the Yurok tribe employees to help do, what's it called? To do the revegetation and also grubbing. And so here I'm removing some, what is it? Star thistle. I'm going to pretend that was a question to the audience. Man, people here are so smart. But with having Indigenous people do this work, I've seen so much sense of pride, reconnection to these environments that we were removed from, and this new observation that's happening. Like my teammates, when doing this work, have been able to tell when things are going to bloom, like when there's going to be berries the next year. They are cultivating these relationships with specific plants. They're going back to specific plants they collected berries from years before, and getting these close observations of when each plant is blooming, maybe why that is, and reestablishing these connections and talking to the plants actually and being like, because traditionally we don't take all the berries from a plant because we leave some for the birds, we leave some for the plants, etc., other animals. And the revegetation work requires you to take every berry that you see that's ripe. And so that kind of goes against our cultural way of doing things. But the staff members are talking to the plants being like, hey, we know we're not supposed to do this, but this is what we're using these berries for. It's going to be used to help revegetate all this area for you, etc. And it'll be good for you long term. And so just like those small things that I really don't think a crew that was hired that was non-Indigenous would take the time to really make that understanding and connection with. And for me, that was really exciting to see. And I definitely think the quality of work that comes from that is much higher than someone who's just trying to make their 9-to-5 job wage. And so for me, that is to say that part of revegetation, part of restoration should also be native language revitalization and considering that in projects as well. Because, for example, the Yurok Tribe's language department is almost all grant funded. And for me, when there's such a huge resource of information that's being underutilized and understudied, it shouldn't have to be grant funded or worry about if they're going to get funding every single year to keep studying our language and keep passing it on. And this is a quote from Eloy, who is a really great lawyer that stuck with me when I read it, is that Indigenous culture teaches us to respect rivers, lakes, plants, animals, and the spiritual beings who live in these places. You cannot solve the climate crisis without including Indigenous peoples and without protecting their territories. And so to wrap up, these are 2 books if you want to learn more that I recommend: Wild by Design by Laura Martin, and also the Clear Aloud book. This is mainly for university research, but like honestly, reading this book, I think it'd be useful for anyone. It goes a lot into what it means to be anti-colonial and decolonization within science spaces. I see people taking pictures with their phones. I can also post these on my Instagram if you want to get them later too. The thing about my session later, if you want to chat, feel free to come. We can talk more or gossip. If you have any juicy gossip, especially come. But to leave you with this last understanding that I've gotten through all these years, and I don't have that many years, but I'm only 27. But when it comes to restoration, is that if we cared about Native Americans, about Native American rights and involvement in restoration, a fraction as much as we show care through funding and efforts for plants and animal rejuvenation, we would be in a much better place and further towards our goals with both thriving. So that is my time. And thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. I'm waiting for someone to take a mic or tell me something to do. All right, do we have Q&A? Are we doing Q&A? Okay, we're doing Q&A. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, in the back. Yes, I can give you the specific citations if you want afterwards. I have a bunch for John Mayer, so it's whichever one you want. But yeah, come talk to me afterwards and I can give you contacts for all those things. Any more questions? Yeah.
Do you have a way of articulating or quantifying, maybe by percentage, how much restoration plays into the, I'm going to call it the economy of Native Americans? You talked about the revegetation for that family.
Yeah.
This is an example. So how big of a part of the local economy is that effort going to be?
So.
And in the broader sense, how big a part is restoration in the local economy?
When it comes to economy, I mean, I wish I had more specific numbers off the top of my head. It's becoming a bigger part of the economy for us. Like, for example, when I started my engineering degree, there was no engineering positions in my tribe. Like, I was going into this degree hoping one day there'd be a position for me to come back to and work at for my tribe. And thankfully, we got a organization together and started organizing around restoration work and construction. And so because we're building out that branch, now we're getting more and more jobs around there. And so I'm at least able to work full time when it comes to restoration jobs. But we only have I think we have 6 engineers on staff right now and 2 PEs or professional engineers, but we're growing pretty readily as we get more knowledge and have more practice in this restoration world, and also as funding is coming in for restoration projects more and more. And so I can't answer for all tribes because, right, there's over 500 of federally recognized tribes and they vary hugely on economy. And my tribe mainly runs off of grant money still. And so for us, we're building it up, but not enough and not where we want to be. We want to continue growing out that field. I don't know if that answers it directly, but I hope that helps. In the front.
Can you share any other examples of, successful involvement with Indigenous people in restoration in other areas?
Yeah, oh, I'm gonna tease you and say you have to come to my session this afternoon to hear that answer. Oh, sorry about that. In the back? Yeah, that is another good, I'm gonna give you half of it now and half of it if you come to the session again to later this afternoon, because that's a longer answer. But I mean, some of the roadblocks is just not being taken seriously and asked to do free work, or being felt sometimes this is what it was like for me when I started doing presentations too, where it was considered a privilege for me to have a voice at all. When people who had other areas of knowledge and had other expertise were getting paid for their work. And yet I was just expected to do the same work for free, because it should be a privilege for someone who comes from my background to have the opportunity to speak at all. And sometimes with tribes it's like that too. Often tribes get asked to do all this free work without any funds, just because they should feel privileged that, these organizations are deciding to work with them finally. And so that automatically kind of shows that power imbalance and a disrespect to these tribes when coming in contact with them. And then also ignoring maybe the history of these different organizations with tribes. Maybe they've had a really bad past, and that person who's getting sent in to talk with tribes doesn't realize that, but the tribes remember that. And it's kind of unfair for both groups that way. And then for me personally, on the trail to become an engineer, I was told constantly that I'm only in college because of affirmative action, even though only 30% of colleges considered race in 2014 when I joined school. And because of that, no matter how many clubs I led and started in high school, no matter what my grades were, how many AP classes I took, I was just always told I'm taking a deserving spot of another student, and that I shouldn't be in college, and that I'm just taking up space for something I don't deserve. And people just kept getting that concept in their mind. And then also when I go out in the world, people usually see me as more likely as a house cleaner than I am an engineer. And if I was standing in the room with one of my other friends who's a white dude, and people had to choose which one's the engineer, they would always point to my friend and not me. And so trying to combat those daily challenges not only is very difficult through getting through education, but also I've had a lot of women friends of color who have dropped out of engineering, or have known people who dropped out of engineering because of discrimination in the workplace. And that goes beyond working with the tribe, working with these other organizations. Just those tiny bits of discrimination just really eat at you over time. And when your land's hurting and you're hurting personally that way, it's really hard to come back from that. Sorry, this is a depressing. But yeah, I mean, I'm here and I'm hoping to make that easier for other people, and hopefully by you all being here too, you can start to make that way to make it easier for other people and other perspectives to come into the workplace. So they feel welcomed and bring other people to join in with us instead of feeling excluded. Yeah. Okay, last question.
Thank you for sharing that, because they're hard to say out loud in general, much like on the stage. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask more about, I led the story about collecting the berries and normally leaving some but having to take them all. And I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for that knowledge? I'm all about written documents changing. So is there flexibility for that knowledge to be passed back up, so that rather than you having to apologize to the plant, maybe there's some way of actually taking that traditional knowledge and leaving some for the birds and leaving some for the plant itself? I'm just wondering, is there that feedback loop at all in that project in general, or do you see opportunity for that?
That's a good question. That's a question for my boss. I'm one of those people that like go into these areas and I'm just like, why do we do things this way? Again, with like the always questioning stuff. And I feel like I get very annoying to my professors and very annoying to my bosses. But like that's one of my long list of things to see what can be changed. Because again, like what I was saying about being not only like decolonizing, but being anti-colonial is not just having Indigenous peoples participate in the ways we have with conservation traditionally that was created pretty much by white people for white people around the environments, but deconstructing it and recontextualizing it in a way that's inclusive to Indigenous people's beliefs that could be beneficial for everyone. And so for me, there must be a yes to that. If there isn't a yes, right, we'll find a yes to how to change those documents. So
How do you, those voices of perspective, so it doesn't sit on your shoulders singularly to find it?
that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, like the community building is a huge part of it, right? Like the people you meet here that can advocate for you, and then maybe who aren't in your space, but work with other people that are in your space or in government offices, and finding out again where those decisions are being made, and then the process of how to change it is one of the big steps. But yeah, not doing it alone is a big part of it. If any of you guys want to help me, like feel free to reach out and then I can give you work if you're not busy already. You guys don't look busy. Just kidding. But yeah, thank you. And then I guess just to leave off with that, because it's like kind of depressing note here and there. It's hard to talk about American Indian history and not be depressing. And it's hard to be in environmental studies not to be depressed. But for me, like the fact that we've had thousands of years of successful management that's worked for us, and that we still have people around who understand this knowledge and these relationships with plants and animals, gives me a ton of hope when it comes to conservation and climate change. And also when I have these opportunities to talk to other youth about what it's like to be in the climate field and how passionate they are about it and how much energy they have to changing the world, it fills me with a lot of hope and determination. Otherwise, I wouldn't be up here to talk to y'all if I didn't think there was change that was possible. And so I'm looking forward to how each of you, right? No one can change the world by themselves, and no one can do all this ecological restoration work by themselves. I mean, if you have ever tried to like dig a hole with a shovel, that's already a lot of work. But together we can make really big impact, and not being discouraged about these hiccups that we're having. Don't let that stop you from these larger beliefs of what we can accomplish together. Because even if just all of us in this room were to collaborate, we could make huge changes in the system. And I'm sure of that. Thank you.